Hello. Hello and welcome to a Friday. There was a couple of false starts there because I'm still automating things with Stream Deck and all the toys and tools. Welcome to a PerfBits. PerfBits, I'm a PerfBit. I'm just one little bit of the PerfBits world. And I believe you got a little bit of the Mark Tomlinson, the chief performacologist, here at PerfBits. It's been a really exciting week for a couple of different reasons. One, there's two fantastic events that were happening online virtually. One was Dynatrace Perform, and a bunch of our good friends. We would normally be broadcasting live, podcasting from PerfBits world at Perform in Las Vegas. If you've ever, there's this great intro I should find. I think it's somewhere in Brian's things, which is doing a voiceover like a fight, you know, like the big ring fighting champ fighting thing was live from Las Vegas. It's really hilarious. And so it was some really amazing stuff, free to register. Still, even I think posthumously, you can go to Dynatrace Perform, look it up, and you can get all of the details. But there's some amazing announcements, some great stuff from them about in the observability space. It makes sense that people, I think they announced, Dynatrace announced, but also the other APM vendors in the world are bringing in security, sort of bad actors, because a lot of security information, the scanning and such, is done at infrastructure level. And so now if you have app level observability, tracing, logging, and starting to see things almost from the business perspective, you know, if somebody steals all of your socket addresses or a bunch, you know, somebody is playing solitaire on your servers, that might not affect the business and you might not really care. But we all know that there's security things that we care about that's in an application database or in the application itself, data flowing through an application. So bad actor detection and what's called a RASP, which would be like real-time application blocking or protection, which is a really interesting announcement from an observability space. But you'll see it in other APM vendors. It's just in the Dynatrace world, it is more comprehensive, in my opinion, capabilities there. So check that out. And some other great stuff around AI apps. Captain, there's this great command line interface. If you've got tons of Dynatrace instances, there's a Monaco is this great monitoring as code, which everything should be as code. So check out Dynatrace Perform. The other thing that I forgot to mention last week was our friend Joe Colantonio and the Test Guild was Automation Guild was happening this week. And I think he put, Joe, I'm sorry I didn't mention it last week, but it's been all over the place in the test automation world, which includes non-functional testing as well. So shout out for the Perf Guild, which is hiding somewhere in there. Performance and SRE, there's a podcast that Joe does that I've been on, Leandra's been on, and we've been supportive of. So the Automation Guild was epic this week. And I think there may still be a chance. Just reach out to Joe or look up the Automation Guild online. In Twitter, there's prolific stuff. But there were, I think, damn near 100 different speakers over the course of the week. And if you know Joe's operation, he does it all himself. It's pretty amazing. Just the way that works. So shout out to them. And of course, PerfBits, before we get going, a shout out to our longtime supporting sponsors, Tricentis Neoload, and Flood. They each had some announcements this week, particularly the Neotis world commenting and working with Perform, because Neoload, Henrik had done a bunch of great work to bring Neoload and Dynatrace together from a Captain perspective. So look for some of those. That's pretty cool. A shout out to Ryan Folk and Folk Consulting, because they're just smarty pants, those guys. Check them out if you need somebody to help guide you. So thank you, Ryan and the folks at Folk Consulting. And last but not least, Catchpoint APM. Which we recognize, you know, these are somewhat competitors. These companies evolve. Neoload and Flood were independent companies, and now they're part of Tricentis family, which is cool. And, you know, Catchpoint is pulling in web page test and still some really cool stuff coming from Henry and the guys, Tim over there. Really cool stuff. But we recognize sometimes, you know, competitors or sales departments get competitive. But actually, at the end of the day, we all have to be helping one another as a community to succeed in the complexities. These tools are not easy to use necessarily, right? So the concepts and everything that we like to support everyone coming together to make us successful. So thank you to our sponsors. And we'll see some deep dive stuff. We're working with Roger. Actually, I'm going to mention Roger and Federico. I'll say his name correctly this week. Federico. Fede and Roger and Sophie from Abstractica. And some really cool stuff from the JMeter world that we'll see move stuff. So thank you to them as well. This week, I wanted to talk about the question of the week, which is kind of the fun thing I'm doing. I get some traction in our Discord. If you want to join the Discord, you can send me a DM. We welcome a few different people that popped in. I think one finally made it in, which is Priyanka. So welcome, Priyanka, to the Discord. PerfBits, the PerfBits Cafe is the Discord community. And it's small. It's not very busy, but, you know, Arlene's over there. Fede's over there. Roger's over there now too, and I'll jump in with some of the thread that we have going there with those guys. So if you want to join us in the Discord land, we can. That would be really, really cool. But I want to talk about the question of this week was percentiles. And when measuring response times during a test, do you use a percentile? Most of us do. Do you have a standard that you follow for this? If so, what percentiles, or also, they can also be known as quantiles, right? Quantiles can give you a specific single measurement within a huge frequency distribution, in a huge distribution of samples. What particular was the first sample that matches that particular quantile? Or you can have sort of an aggregate. If I've actually been reviewing quantiles as part of my use of raw data in Influx. InfluxDB has Flux 2, or InfluxDB2. The Flux language, the query language, is very different. And instead of sort of using Grafana and percentiles, I'm actually doing quantile calculation in the raw data. And what do you use? So I threw this question out there, and it's, I think, 2 weeks in a row, I've thrown a couple questions out there that are really boring. Really boring, except for super performance nerds like Roger and Fede, which is great. And might I add a shout out to Stephen Townsend, our friend, one of the many performance engineers from the other hemisphere, who is recently moved to SRE, but did a great blog post really talking about how he grew his skills as an engineer, as an architect, and even as a collaborator in IT through being a performance engineer. And one of the key things that he and Stain's another guy in the Neotis pack, that they had worked together, and there's a whole section in there where Steven's talking about raw data, and you'll miss stuff. And there's a great visualization, and I'm gonna try to do this if I look at that. Isn't that nice? All works like a visualization. Like if you have raw data, like this is, let's say this is just response time over time. And your raw data has response time that goes up and down and up and down and up and down. It has all these spikes. And oddly, if you drew your SLO right around there, right? So somewhere about the, let's say 80th or 90th percentile, if you didn't look at the raw data might say, well, I'm going to kind of even out everything at, say, the 90th percentile is going to be 90% of the samples or lower than that number, whatever this number is. And that number could be, let's say it's 1 second or 2 seconds. It would chop off all the spikes and make that graph like, oh, I'm meeting my SLO. But you're violating your SLO 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times you violated that SLO. But if it's an SLA, being an agreement contractually, you might be fine legally to do that, right? So there was an interesting question about percentiles, and Fede's first response was really looking at the 98th percentile and how different they are, comparing them to the maximum. So when Federico was talking about using percentiles to look at the maximum, so let's say sometimes you'll see in JMeter or some of the tools, there's like a histogram view that kind of talks about, let's say this is 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds. And let's say you had a grouping of transactions where the majority of the samples that come in are right around that 206 milliseconds, something like that, right? And so if you said, look, the 90th percentile is giving me 200 milliseconds, 90% of them, this is 90%. The 90th percentile would actually maybe lean towards being less than 200 milliseconds, if I think about that grouping from a histogram group, right? So giving a view of percentiles in general is basically the idea that the language is 90%, I'm going to go back over here, 90% of the transactions, and if you're doing testing of real user sessions, 90% of those users will experience that response time or less. So let's say the 90th percentile is 6 seconds. That good old web, 6 seconds or less rendering in a browser. If you measured that at the full raw data, you would probably have some transient spikes that were greater than that, right? So if I just do a simple, just a bell curve, but there's a grouping of, let's say right here, we have things took 0 seconds and things took 10 seconds. So this is response time, right? And this is the count, the number of samples at that response time. And let's say this would be about 5, here's 6. If you had a bunch of samples, none of them were less than 5 seconds. All right, so we know that bottom of the graph, like for some, you cannot get things that are that. But you'll see a grouping in a bell curve for a given transaction where a very high number of the transactions are right around 6 seconds. And if you say 100%, what's, of the average, if the average of this, what's the mean or the median? If I'm measuring right at the average, that would be right the middle of that bell curve. So let's say that's, 6 point something seconds right in the middle, right? That's an average. But that's because that means there's the median, which is the same number of samples below or above, or the mean average, which is total up the number of accounts and divide them by the total number. So add them up and divide by the total count in the frequency. So my habit is to say, well, look at all of these transactions that are at 7, 8, maybe 9 seconds. Those are still pretty, if my goal here is to really hit 6 seconds for rendering a whole page, wow, there's a lot of samples here at 7 and 8 and 9 seconds that are pretty unhappy people. Like your AppDex would be pretty sour at that point. So that's why we'll say, instead of measuring at the 50th percentile, which is the mean right in the middle, one way to think about that, is I want to include more of the samples of the full distribution in my communication of what's the experience of the application. So let's say I went with an 80th percentile. In this graph, that might be somewhere close to 7 or 8 seconds. If I go to my management and say, hey, 80% of our users are going to experience 7 or 8 seconds. That's 2 seconds over our SLO if I measure it there. Now, I could communicate to management, hey, the average experience of the average user on the site meets the SLO. But that means at 50%, half of the users are not meeting the SLO. And that's like, you're kind of hiding the ugly truth at that point. Interestingly enough, you'll see in a lot of the tools, LoadRunner, K6, NeoLoad as well, I think they come out of the box with 90th percentile. So if it were a perfect graph, 90th percentile would be another way to say 90%. Now that's a very confident number. Like we have a very clean test and we very much so trust our numbers. So saying you've got a 90% of the samples were at 9 seconds. Boy, that's pretty good. Now, another graph you might draw over this is say, hey, you know what? If I draw a graph from 5 seconds and I've got, a graph that looks like that, which is not balanced as much, that could be there's only 10% of those users that are over the 9-second mark. And now if I redraw this to say 6 seconds, 90% of the users are at 6 seconds or less, my graph may look more like that. right? Where this little itty bitty part, this little 10% right here, those are the only people over the SLA. But here, 90% of those users, and I love my colors, green, that should be happy users. 90%, including the average, including the standard deviation that says, that should go over that amount as well. On either side of that, we're only excluding this 10% over the SLA. Then we could communicate to management, hey, at the 90th percentile, 90% of those users are going to communicate, are going to experience 6 seconds or less, which meets our SLO or SLI, right? Really cool. All right. The other thing that came in, so thank you to Frederico. We had a good thing. He says he always uses the percentile at 90th percentile or 95th. When I got into doing sort of high-speed trading, not myself as a high-speed trader, but sort of advising some customers in that space, they use the 98th percentile. And there's two reasons you might go really, one, the test environments are really clean. There's no weird anomalies. Only 2% of those transactions are weird. They could even have like low-level hardware problems, little buffer problems, dropped retransmissions, network, like physical electronic problems when you measure. And of course, for high-speed trading, sometimes you're talking about lots of money really fast. So they go with a very stringent 98th percentile. And then the other thing you talked about was, we talked about standard deviation. And just to give you, I'm going to go back and forth because I automated that. Standard deviation to me, if I take some sort of a bell curve that looks like that, a standard deviation tells me from the mean what this curve looks like. So if, let's say I have again, a 6-second response time in the middle at the average, and there's how much of the standard deviation off of that, meaning how narrow is that curve? Well, one standard deviation away from that could be 8 seconds. So I could have a 4-second difference between one standard deviation away from the mean, from the middle. So that means it could be as fast as 4 seconds and as slow as 8 seconds. In terms of, hey, the deviation from that mean. Meanwhile, you could have a very narrow standard deviation. So you could have another curve where it looks tall and skinny, and you've only got maybe 200 milliseconds. So you've got, at this end, 6.2 seconds, and at this side, 5.8, which means it's really, really accurate. There's no weird, sometimes there's blocks, sometimes there's variation in the payload. So these are really specific API calls or functions or methods. And it's always coming in within maybe 400 milliseconds. So 400 millisecond standard deviation. It just means the sampling, when that distribution shows up, it looks really, really narrow. So that, to me, is how I make sense of standard deviation. And so just giving a number of, hey, it took 6 seconds or less in the percentile. The other thing Roger put in as well, thank you, Roger and Federico, the 90th, 95th, and 98th are something, 99th, actually, Roger talks about 99th, which is almost 100%, like it's leaving off that one little 1% at the end. And you'll see this in certain tools where you can configure that. I'll give you 2 tips before we wrap things up. When you get to calculating your percentiles, you can do it in the test tool. And if you do it in the test tool for performance, if you do it in the load generator, remember, a load generator is working really hard to generate load and do it very cleanly and very accurately. And calculating an aggregation like a mean or a percentile or quantile is CPU intensive because it's a very small hash algorithm that has to count things up and then divide them into the numbers. So those operations are very, very CPU intensive. And if your load generator is running and already using CPU to generate load, you don't necessarily want to be calculating aggregates at the same time on the same CPU that you're generating load from. So my preference, my tip to you, especially if you're going to get to having multiples, where Roger's talking about 90th, 95th, 98th, like the backend listener in JMeter, like some of the defaults are give you those three aggregates are sent back in the backend listener. Well, we're calculating three aggregates every 10 seconds, whatever the summarize or the frequency you set to do that. If you got lots of CPU, great. If you got lots of load generators, great. If you don't, you might want to just spit the raw data out and let the time series database or another aggregator do that work on a CPU somewhere else within the test harness, especially for very, very large load testing. Again, the larger the load, the more the samples, the more hash you need to do to get those aggregates to actually show up in a percentile graph. If you've ever had a very large load test with a couple million samples and you say, I want to see the 90th percentile, you'll just see the database. Like I hit influx, it'll just sit and crawl. So I'm like, I'll throw some SS. So I'm performance tuning the time series database. Cassandra does a nice job at this as well. So that's the sort of percentiles and why we would use them in load testing to communicate. Well, at the 100th percentile, there's a pretty noisy test environment. So we have a lot of outliers that I'd rather not sit and explain, well, we were running the test and then we executed this thing and then this other blocker happened, but that's not going to happen. Suddenly you're 30 minutes into explaining anomalies and not focusing on the business case where, hey, 98% of the time, this system is going to work great. And we should pass this test and move forward. Now, if you're automating in an unattended fashion, those aggregates, this is where it comes in really important because we're not, from a human perspective, reviewing the raw data on every single test run on every single promotion down the pipeline. So if you're using Kepton or you're using other tools on the pipeline to indicate pass or fail for a whole myriad thing in a load test, you're going to want to be careful about using very, very stringent percentiles. You could be more permissive at different levels. The further you are away from production, the cleaner the test environment might be. And remember, production's really dirty. The cleaner the test environment might be, and the more accurate and anomaly-free your test results data set will be. So you can be more stringent in your load testing. Remember, it does come back to communicating to human beings that meaning of, hey, there you go. A quick shout out. I think it's Ipronea, maybe. A question about the APIs spiking in the beginning of a test to about 30-second response time and then averaging down to 5 seconds. In the beginning of a test, this is turning into a fantastic chat. Thank you for your question. In this case, what she's talking about is pretty cool, actually. And it has to do with like caching or warming up a system. At the beginning of the test, this is time, and this is response time. You'd have maybe at the beginning of the test, let's say you're doing a ramp up and you're ramping up all your users, right? At the beginning of the test, like right away, boom, 30-second response time. And things look really bad. But then down here, 5 seconds, they come right back down, and then maybe at the end it gets slow. But her question, if I understand it right, is like, what is happening right here? And that is one of the reasons you use a percentile, because these are sort of, hey, we started the load test cold and nothing was warmed up. And so we had to JIT compile something, or we had to cache a bunch of things, or we pulled in a bunch of records from the database and got them in memory, and they're warmed up and they're fast. Load generators even, we're just getting them to wake up, and now I can start creating threads because I've allocated physical resources. And when you get to running and calculating the results of the rest of the test, you might want to throw out the first 5 minutes. And it's not indicative of, the real interesting thing is like, oh, as we were ramping up load, there was something interesting way over here. So my answer to you is that's probably warming up a system and caching, and you might want to exclude the first few minutes of that. Another tip to help with that is do a little smoke test, do a little warm-up test for like 5 minutes before you run the real test. So you can do sort of a start and stop, and then run the real test the rest of your load test. And then everything will be warmed up and ready to run. And And of course, here's another tip. If you're automating it unattended, if your little warm-up test has 100% errors, you might actually just throw an alert and skip running the rest of the test because it's just probably going to be errors. Something's wrong with the build or something like that. Fantastic. Great question. Thank you for sending that in. I will say thank you again to everyone for joining another week and a Friday. It's warmer. It's nice outside. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Do something fun. Be sure to check out those 2 events from the automation folks, from the automation guild, test guild with Joe Colantonio. My brain's working. And of course, Dynatrace Perform are very, very cool. And I will see you guys next week. I'll do a question of the week on Monday. If you want to join the Discord, let me know. We would love to have you join the community. And on behalf of Henrik and Leandro and James and all of our collaborators, thank you and have a fantastic weekend.